I went back to the store simply because I realized my wallet wasn't in my bag like it always was. Nothing worth a fast heartbeat. I just wanted to grab what I'd forgotten. Marla, the shift manager that day, gave me her usual practical look and said she needed to check the cameras to make sure I wasn't mistaken. I nodded. I didn't think twice until the screen lit up and showed a man I knew far too well. Derek stepped into the frame with a wooden box in his hand. The box had carvings I could never mistake, my family's mark, the one that used to sit on my father's desk. He looked around, not rushed, not nervous. Then he opened the storage room door, set the box in the darkest corner, closed the door, and walked out as if he'd never been there. I stayed still. I didn't ask Marla anything. I didn't react. I just watched that image replay in my mind like a sharp, dry cut. Something I thought had disappeared years ago was in my husband's hands, and he hid it. Not kept it safe, not found it by chance. He hid it. To understand why that moment chilled me so deeply, we probably have to go back to when everything between Derek and me still looked like a quiet marriage, before the truth started falling apart piece by piece. My name is Quinn. I'm an antique auction specialist, a job that isn't loud but demands a sharp eye and the ability to read history through the smallest scratches. Most of the time, I work in silence, taking notes, studying details, used to telling real from fake by the slightest change in a carving or the shade of wood. That habit stuck with me in my everyday life, even when I wasn't trying. Derek was different. He was a freelancer in marketing, always trying to prove he understood culture, loved talking about art, like he lived with it since he was a kid. I used to think it was a charming part of him. Ambitious, a bit impulsive, but harmless. There were nights he sat listening to me talk about some antique piece, nodding like he was absorbing every detail. Looking back now, I'm not sure if he cared about the stories or about the value of the things in them. And Marla, the one who pulled up the camera for me, was the straightforward type. She did her job, didn't ask extra questions. She had no idea how important that wooden box was. Maybe that's why the moment hit me even harder. I was the only one who understood what I was looking at. That wooden box had sat on my father's desk for years. He kept old letters and notes about our family's collecting history inside it. When he passed, I cleaned out his office and realized the box was gone. At the time, I was too overwhelmed to think clearly. I assumed someone grabbed it by accident while we were clearing the house, or that it got lost in the move. I told myself that everything inside was only sentimental anyway, but the truth is, it wasn't just a keepsake. It was tied to my family's history, and Derek knew that. He knew I'd searched for it over and over before finally giving up. What I never paid attention to was how overly curious he became whenever I talked about my family's antiques. He asked about origins, age, estimated value, and sometimes about pieces I hadn't even fully mentioned. I thought he was just curious. Now I'm not so sure. Standing in front of the screen, I didn't feel angry. I felt something I knew well from my work. The moment you realize the object in front of you isn't what you thought it was. No noise, no drama, just the truth showing its shape. I didn't know why Derek had that box, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a mistake. And if he chose to hide it in the storage room of a store, the reason wasn't going to be simple. I left the store that day with the image of that wooden box burned into my mind. Not angry, just a different kind of stillness. The kind you feel when you know what you just saw isn't the first moment. It's only the first time you caught it. The truth rarely appears whole the first time. It leaks out before that in small signs, if you're willing to see them. And when I started lining up those signs, Derek came into focus in a way he never wanted. The times he asked about the value of my family's antiques, I used to take it as curiosity. Now, when I think back on each question, they're sharper than I remember. He didn't ask about the stories behind the pieces. He asked about the lowest price, the highest price, the average auction range. I answered because I thought he was trying to understand my work. but his questions sounded like they came from a collector, not a husband sharing his wife's interests. I remember once he picked up a small silver box and asked, "If this went to auction, would it be worth anything?" I said its sentimental value was bigger than its market value. He laughed, nodded, but there was something in his eyes that looked like he was calculating something else. I let it go. Back then, I didn't know I should have looked closer. Then there were the times he accidentally took small items out of the house. Sometimes it was the silver spoon my father used to stir ink, sometimes a tiny badge that belonged to him. Every time I asked, Derek just said he showed them to friends so they could see he had an interesting life. At the time, I thought he just liked seeming knowledgeable. Now every memory cuts like a small blade, sharp, quiet, but enough to tell me those moments weren't accidental the way he said. He had a habit of putting things back just a bit off, like someone who didn't really know where they belonged. I used to fix it without thinking. That was before I saw him hide the box in the storage room. Now those small misplacements feel like quiet reminders of the truth. He touched more than I realized. One night, staring at the ceiling, I remembered something he said months earlier. He wanted to get into the collecting world. I laughed at the time, thinking he was joking. Derek wasn't the kind of person patient enough to pursue something that required real knowledge, but he still talked about how you need a base collection to make an impression. I forgot that comment. Now it's back, clear, like he said it last night. A week before the camera incident, I met a friend from the auction world. She mentioned very casually, someone's trying to force their way into the scene by showing off heirlooms. Apparently they're not actually theirs. She didn't say a name. I didn't ask. Back then, I didn't think anything of it. But that memory clings to me now like a puzzle piece finally finding its place. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. My work doesn't allow that. I just took note in my mind. Derek said he wanted to join the collecting world. Someone in the field said a person was using someone else's heirlooms, and he had just hidden my father's box in the storage room of a shop that had nothing to do with him. Just clues. But clues never stand alone. That night, I went home and stood in front of the antique cabinet. I'd opened it hundreds of times in my life, but never with that kind of feeling. The warm light on the wood looked familiar, but as I looked at each piece, I realized that familiarity was only on the surface. My mother's old ring used to sit slightly to the left. Now it was almost centered in the drawer. A fragment of my father's brooch, something I always placed parallel to the edge of its box, was now tilted. The changes were tiny, but I was the one who arranged them. I knew where everything belonged. A few items that had disappeared and later reappeared flashed through my mind as I looked at the cabinet. I remembered once searching for a brass paperclip and not finding it, only for it to show up in the exact right spot weeks later. Back then, I thought I misplaced it. Now I'm not so sure. I stared at the cabinet for a long time, not to look for what was missing, but to feel the interference, the kind of shifting a stranger wouldn't notice, but someone who belongs with these objects would. The feeling was cold, not like loss, more like being breached without warning. The wooden box was only the surface. Derek didn't just hold it in his hands. He touched far more than that. Long enough, often enough, that I had to re-examine every detail as if I were appraising my own life. I closed the cabinet softly, the way I always did when handling something fragile, but inside, there was nothing fragile left, only a growing clarity. Derek hadn't just hidden the box. He'd been building an image of himself out of my family's legacy piece by piece, without thinking I would notice soon. And if he dared to hide the wooden box, whatever he planned next wouldn't be simple. The next morning, with that cold feeling from the cabinet still sitting in me, I went back to the store, not looking for a confrontation. I just wanted to see more of the truth. Marla looked at me like I might be back about the wallet again, but I told her plainly I needed to see the cameras from the previous days. She raised a brow but didn't ask anything. Marla wasn't the type to be curious beyond what her job required. She turned on the system, typed in a code, and stepped aside so I could watch on my own. I rewound day by day, not because I expected anything, but because I needed to know the scale of what I was dealing with. Derek showed up for the first time 2 days earlier. He looked around, hands in his pockets, like someone waiting for a meeting. Then he moved toward the shelves near the storage room door, stood there for a few seconds, and walked away. He didn't touch anything, but his eyes were too alert for it to be nothing. The second time, he was carrying a cloth bag. He stood in a hidden corner, opened the bag, then closed it again, as if checking something inside. The posture was the same. Someone who didn't want to belong in the frame. I rewound to the third day. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked into the store like a regular customer. But his steps were too light to be casual. He checked his phone, then headed straight for the storage room, as if he knew exactly how long he needed to be there without running into anyone. Marla stood behind me, arms crossed. "He came in 3 times, she said quietly, her voice flat. "Do you want to watch it again?" I shook my head. 3 times was enough. I thought I'd prepared myself, but the footage from the third visit threw another piece at me, sharper than I expected. Derek came into the frame with a sheet of paper folded into quarters. He opened it and held it toward his phone, like he was showing someone a list. I leaned closer to the screen. I recognized some of the names, items from my family's collection, even pieces very few people knew I owned. He read each line, nodding, as if confirming something. Then he brought the phone closer, and I caught a corner of the reflected screen, the name of an appraiser in the auction world, someone I'd worked with on a project years ago, someone known for evaluating the value of private collections. Derek was scheduling something, or asking for advice. Whatever it wasn't small. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act from someone curious. It was preparation. The kind someone makes when they want to show up in a community they don't belong to and want to do it using my name, my past, my family's legacy. The wooden box was just the piece he chose as his highlight. That list, that was the foundation he was building. I watched the video until he walked out of the store, folding the paper and putting it away. No rush, no fear. He did it like he had the right. Marla asked if I wanted her to export the footage. I just said, "Later." My voice sounded distant, like it didn't belong to me. I didn't need a copy yet. I needed to confirm what I'd just seen. I left the store and stepped into the cold wind. My hands didn't shake, but something inside me went still. I pulled out my phone and called an old colleague, Jonah. We'd worked together on a verification project last year. He picked up after 2 rings. I asked lightly, the way you'd ask about a client case, "Have you worked with the appraiser Gray recently?" Jonah let out a short laugh. "Gray?" He's swamped. "Sounds like someone just booked a trial appraisal to debut their own collection." I kept my voice steady. "Did he say a name?" "No," he said. But Gray mentioned the person was showing off an item with major sentimental value. Something like a wooden family heirloom box. I didn't answer right away. Jonah went on, "Ring any bells? You remember objects the way people remember breathing. Any collection with something like that, you'd know." I didn't confirm or deny anything. I just needed the information. Finally, Jonah ended with, "Gray said the person wants the appraisal to be their opening move. I'm guessing they're trying to break into the collecting world." I thanked him and hung up. I didn't need to ask more. What I saw on the camera and what Jonah just told me lined up too cleanly. Derek was trying to enter the collecting world using my father's wooden box, not borrowing it, not holding it for me, using it as a launch pad. That evening, I waited for Derek to come home. I didn't try to act normal. I just sat at the dining table under the warm light where he'd see me before anything else. The door opened. He walked in with an unusual excitement. He tossed his coat onto a chair and moved toward me with a smile that was too wide to feel natural. "You won't believe this," he said, full of confidence. "I landed a huge opportunity today. A cultural project. I think I'm about to make a big leap." I looked at him. He didn't see anything in my expression, or he didn't want to. I asked, calm and direct, "Did you tell them who that item belongs to?" His smile was still there, but his eyes weren't. The smile froze quickly, like my question didn't exist in the script he'd prepared. "What?" he asked, his voice a little higher. "I saw the cameras," I said, my expression unchanged. "And I saw you hide the box. I also saw you show someone the list of my family's antiques." The room went very quiet. Derek fumbled for a moment, pulled out a chair, sat down, trying to find words. I just wanted to help your family's legacy get recognized. You're always talking about how important your father was. I talked about sentimental value," I cut in, still steady. "Not value for you to use as leverage to get into a world you don't belong to." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Whatever lines he'd planned to convince me with seemed caught in his throat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain further. I didn't tell him he was wrong or how much he'd hurt me. I just let him hear the hollow sound of the excuses he was trying to build. The silence between us didn't hurt. It was sharp, like a blade touching just enough skin to remind you it's there. And when he lowered his head, I knew I'd stepped into the first stage of the truth, where every layer starts to fall away, bit by bit. After that conversation, Derek grew quieter than usual. He tried to look busy, as if being busy could dilute the truth spread out between us in the living room. But that quiet gave me exactly what I needed. Time, not to cool off. I wasn't angry. I'd moved into another phase, one where emotion didn't belong. I needed to observe and act, the same way I would with an antique being prepped for appraisal. The next morning, I contacted the auction house. I didn't mention Derek. I only asked about the upcoming trial appraisal and offered to join as a guest consulting specialist, a role they often gave to experienced people in the field. I'd worked with them for years, so the invitation came quickly and cleanly. No unnecessary questions. I confirmed the date, sent the documents, and let everything move forward like it was just another professional assignment. I didn't touch the wooden box. I didn't ask Derek anything more about the cultural project he mentioned. He didn't bring it up again, and I didn't need to hear it. Each night, when Derek scrolled through his phone with that hidden excitement, I just watched. No judgment, no interference. The irony was that he thought he was preparing for his debut. I was preparing the stage. I didn't tell Derek I'd be at the appraisal. I let him walk into it believing he was rising. A man eager to step into a refined world he didn't fully understand. I used to want to guide him, but now I understood. Some people have to see their own limits to learn they can't cross them by borrowing someone else's light. The day of the appraisal arrived, and Derek woke up earlier than I did. He spent longer than usual fixing his hair in the mirror, wore a pressed shirt, and used the cologne he almost never touched. He wanted to look like someone who belonged to the world he was about to walk into. But that confidence was built on borrowed ground, and I could see how thin it was from a distance. He left the house 10 minutes before me, carrying the wooden box in a way that wasn't trust but possession. He didn't know I was watching his eyes as he locked the door. They were the eyes of a man convinced he was about to be validated. I arrived after him, right as the appraisal was set to begin. The appraisal room was in the main hall of the auction house, bright, simple, elegant. I waited behind a side door where consultants usually stood until the host called us in. I heard the host's voice ring out clearly. "We'll begin with our first guest, who's here to present a family heirloom of significant sentimental value." I didn't need to look to know Derek was stepping forward. When the partition door opened just enough for me to see through, I watched him place the wooden box on the table. His hands shook slightly, but his smile stayed forced and full. He introduced the item as if it were the lifeblood of his family, talking about the beauty of aged wood with a confidence built from scraps of knowledge borrowed from conversations with me. Appraiser Gray began with basic questions. Can you tell us about the item's origin? What period is it from? Do you know what the carvings on the box signify? Derek froze for a beat. He looked at the box as if it might answer for him. He repeated a few shallow lines I'd once mentioned, but they came out disconnected, thin. Gray asked again, a bit deeper. Derek tried to hold the smile, but his responses turned vague, missing the kind of details someone truly connected to the object would know without thinking. No one said anything, but the silence in the room began to shift. It wasn't tense, it was just clear. The kind of clarity you feel when an appraiser realizes the item isn't in the hands of the right person. Finally, Gray turned to the host and asked, Has our guest consultant for today arrived? I'd like her professional opinion. The host nodded. The door opened wide, and I walked in. No one knew I would be there, least of all Derek. When he saw me, his eyes widened like gravity had vanished. His body stayed upright, but something in him dropped straight to the floor. I greeted Gray, greeted the staff, then stood by the table without looking at Derek just yet. I examined the box as if it were a piece I'd never seen before, keeping to professional courtesy. My finger brushed the familiar carving. No shaking, no rush of emotion, just confirmation. I can offer a few observations, I said. Gray nodded, waiting. Derek had lost all the excitement he'd walked in with. He stood there breathing short, shallow breaths. I wasn't there to humiliate him. That wasn't my way. I just wanted the truth to stand where it belonged. This box, I said quietly, belonged to my father. It disappeared years ago when I moved houses. Someone in the room inhaled softly, but no one spoke. Last night, I went on, I saw my husband hide it in the storage room of a retail store. All eyes shifted to Derek. I didn't follow them. I kept my eyes on the box, as if placing it back where it belonged. Not with my hands, but with words. I didn't judge him. I didn't raise my voice. I simply put the truth on the table in a room full of professionals, where transparency isn't optional. It's the foundation. The host cleared his throat, then said to Gray, There's a dispute over ownership. We can't continue evaluating this item under the normal procedure. Gray nodded. Agreed. The appraisal for this piece ends here. The words were light, but Derek heard them like a door slamming shut in his face. The opportunity he wanted, the one he prepared for, the one he tried to borrow his way into, disappeared in a single sentence, spoken in an even tone. I looked at Derek then, not to see how much it hurt him, but to see him finally understand that the world he was trying to push into isn't a place that accepts borrowed legitimacy. Here, provenance is everything. He looked at me, his lips moving but no words forming. There were no excuses solid enough to stand against what had just been exposed in front of that many people. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to win. I didn't want him to kneel or cry or apologize. I wanted him to see the line he tried to cross by taking something that wasn't his. When they closed the file for the appraisal, Derek stood there staring at the box like it was a door that had just shut forever. No more light he thought would shine on him. And I stood still, with the calm of someone who knows revenge isn't always a blow. Sometimes it's the moment the other person finally sees themselves, bare, with nothing to cling to. When the appraisal ended, Derek walked beside me, looking nothing like the man who'd left the house that morning. The wooden box in his hand seemed heavier than it really was. He opened his mouth a few times, trying to find words, but every sentence fell apart before it formed, missing the support of his old confidence. Quinn, I didn't stop walking. You don't need to explain. My voice wasn't raised, and it wasn't sharp in a way meant to hurt. It was flat. "I've heard enough." We got home. Derek stood near the dining table, the same place where he talked last night about his cultural project. He set the box down as if it could somehow rewrite the story for him. "You have to understand," he said, softer now. "I thought this was a chance to—" "I understand," I said, this time looking straight at him. "You wanted to step into the world I live in, but you forgot the first rule in the auction world. Provenance determines value." He lowered his head. No arguing, no defending. Someone like Derek isn't used to being examined under a real light. He's used to borrowing things, borrowing knowledge, borrowing an image, borrowing a legacy. But the truth isn't something he can control. I picked up the box, not snatching it, not rushing. I held it gently, the way you hold a piece of memory that's been out of reach for too many years. I opened the safe, entered a new code, and placed it inside. When the safe door closed, it felt like putting a period at the end of a story I should have finished long ago. Derek watched like someone standing outside his own life. He was silent, and for the first time, that silence wasn't fake. News about the appraisal spread faster than I expected. The collecting world is small, and information travels quickly through channels that aren't official at all. They didn't need the full story. They only needed to know a man brought an item that didn't belong to him to his debut, and had the appraisal stopped because of a dispute over ownership. No one mentioned my name. I didn't need them to, but they mentioned Derek's, not with anger, but with the caution of people who won't risk their reputation on the wrong person. In that world, lacking integrity is a stain you can't scrub out. Someone can be inexperienced or lack knowledge, but they can't lack honesty. Derek lacked the one thing that mattered most. The invitations he hoped for didn't come. The conversations he tried to slip into grew colder. People who once sounded enthusiastic in messages started replying less, shorter, then not at all. No one attacked him, no harsh criticism. But sometimes the silence of a community is heavier than any public fallout. For Derek, it was the exact weight he needed, being pushed back to the edges of a world he once believed he was about to belong to. As for me, I went back to my usual rhythm. Work stayed the same, examining antiques, doing appraisals that required absolute precision, spending long days in a softly lit room. I didn't change my schedule, and I didn't tell the story to anyone who didn't need to hear it. I didn't try to seem strong, I just kept going. But that continuation carried a new weight, a cold steadiness, untouched by the old emotions. Derek still lived in the same house, but the house wasn't the same for him anymore. My silence filled the space, not as punishment, but as a boundary. He lived inside that boundary, knowing he'd crossed a line and couldn't return to where he was with a simple apology. Every night, he tried to start small conversations. I answered just enough to avoid new conflict, not cold in tone, but cold in distance. And that distance wasn't meant to hurt him. It was meant to keep me intact. He understood. And the more he understood, the smaller he became within the walls of the home we once shared. I saw all of it, and I felt neither joy nor sadness. I just noted it, the way you note a crack in an item you hadn't noticed before. One night, while I was filing documents, Derek stood in the doorway of my office. He didn't speak. He just stood there for a few seconds, then walked away. Not because he couldn't find the words, but because he knew anything he said would be lighter than the truth I'd already laid bare in front of him. I set the file folder down, looked around the familiar room, and gently closed the door. The feeling wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge in the way people usually mean it. It was simply the restoration of order. What belonged to me was back where it should be. Derek stayed. But the power he tried to take didn't stay with him. It lived in the silence I held, in the wooden box locked in the safe, in the calm look I gave him each time I walked past. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to leave. I didn't need to erase him from my life to prove anything. I only had to let the truth stand between us, clear enough that he had no choice but to bow his head to it. And when I turned off the living room light that night, I knew the story had ended in a way that wasn't loud, but sharp enough to echo in his mind far longer than any accusation ever could. Truth is never in a hurry. It shows up at the exact moment it needs to, reminding us that real power isn't in a loud voice, but in staying upright when everything around you tilts. I realized that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to respond with anger, but with clarity. Have you ever had a moment that forced you to see someone not through emotion, but through clear eyes? If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe to the channel and follow me on the next journeys. Thank you for listening all the way through. I hope you always have enough calm to see the truth, even when it's uncomfortable.